Welcome to the deep dive. Today we've got, well, a mountain of sources, really. Articles, historical texts, some pretty deep military analyses. And we're going to use them to chart one of the most, frankly, improbable victories in history, the American Revolutionary War.
Yeah, and our goal here for you listening is to give you a structured kind of in-depth shortcut. We're not just rattling off dates. We want to pull out those crucial bits of knowledge, the nuggets that really explain how 13, let's face it, relatively weak colonies managed to achieve independence. We'll dig into the political friction that sparked it all, and then the key military moments, the turning points that actually sealed the deal against, the global superpower of the day, Great Britain.
Absolutely. And just to set the stage right, the starting point, we have to understand the basic setup. This whole conflict kicks off because those 13 colonies in North America, they just fundamentally opposed being directly taxed by Parliament. A British Parliament where they had, well, 0 representatives, no voice.
And it's so important to frame how it began. Initially, it was really an internal British matter, a huge civil dispute, you could say, a kind of family fight. But the whole story pivots dramatically about halfway through. The moment external players got involved, specifically France becoming America's ally, it just instantly flipped from a colonial rebellion into a massive international war. And honestly, that diplomatic shift, that's probably the single biggest factor in why the colonists eventually won.
Okay, let's get into the money side of things, because, while everyone talks about liberty, and rightly so, the actual spark, it was definitely economic. Britain had just fought the 7 Years' War, hugely expensive, fought all over the globe, and the British Crown was looking at a mountain of debt. So their goal was pretty straightforward, raise cash. And, well, they looked across the Atlantic to the colonies.
The irony there is just, it's pretty thick, isn't it? Trying to fix a debt problem, they basically prioritized like short-term cash over long-term political stability. They didn't really see the colonists as political equals, more like an untapped piggy bank. And that led straight into this series of laws, these acts, that just kept escalating things and fundamentally challenged the colonists' ideas about ruling themselves.
Right. Let's walk through some of those early ones, starting with the one that wasn't aimed so much at the average person, but more at cracking down on illegal trade. That's the Sugar Act, 1764. This one was specifically meant to kill that huge smuggling trade in sugar and molasses, mostly coming in from the French and Dutch islands in the Caribbean.
Yeah, and what often gets missed about the Sugar Act isn't just the tax rate itself, which, funny enough, was actually lower than the old one it replaced. It was the enforcement. Suddenly it got really strict. They tightened up customs. And the really controversial part, British officials could now try suspected smugglers in admiralty courts. No colonial juries, which the colonists saw as a direct hit on their rights as Englishmen. The right to be tried by your peers.
So the Sugar Act ruffled the feathers of the merchants, definitely. But the next act, that's the one that really got ordinary people fired up because it touched, well, pretty much everyone's daily life.
And now we're talking of the Stamp Act, 1765. The sources are absolutely right to flag this one. It was the first time Parliament tried to raise money through a direct internal tax inside the colonies. It wasn't about regulating trade coming in or out. It was about collecting money within the colonies themselves.
And the scope of it was just wow. It covered basically any piece of paper you needed for business or legal stuff, deeds, mortgages, contracts, but also newspapers, pamphlets, even playing cards, almanacs, dice. I mean, if you wanted to read the news, buy property, or just play a game of cards, boom, you had to buy a tax stamp from the crown.
And the reaction was immediate and fierce. Groups like the Sons of Liberty popped up almost overnight. It showed this wasn't just about shillings and pence. It was seen as a constitutional emergency. They argued Parliament was trying to steal the power of their own colonial assemblies, the only bodies they felt had the right to tax them internally.
The British did back down pretty quickly on the Stamp Act, actually. The colonial boycotts were incredibly effective, hit them right in the wallet. But Parliament couldn't just let the colonists win that argument about who had ultimate authority, could they? Which, naturally, leads to the next escalation.
Exactly. They repealed the Stamp Act, but in the very same breath passed the Declaratory Act, basically saying, we still have the right to tax you whenever we want. So 2 years later, 1767, boom, the Townshend Acts. The British thought, okay, maybe direct internal taxes are too explosive. Let's try external duties again. So this series of acts put taxes on imported goods, things like lead, glass, paper, and the really big one, tea. But even though these were paid at the port, the purpose was the same political hot potato. The money raised was specifically earmarked to pay the salaries of colonial governors and judges.
And why was that such a sticking point? Paying the officials with his duty money?
because it cut the legs out from under the colonial assembly's main leverage, the power of the purse. See, before, the assemblies could keep governors and judges somewhat in line because they controlled their paychecks. By paying them directly with money raised from these British taxes, Parliament basically made those officials accountable to London, not to the people they governed locally. It was a very deliberate power play to weaken colonial self-government.
Okay, so fast forward another 6 years or so. The final legislative match in the powder keg, the Tea Act of 1773. And this one wasn't even really about raising new tax revenue, was it? It was more like a bailout.
Precisely. It was a desperate move to save the East India Company, which was basically bankrupt and was, a huge part of the British economy. Too big to fail, essentially. The act gave the company a monopoly on selling tea in the colonies. They could bypass middlemen, sell it even cheaper than the smuggled Dutch tea everyone was drinking.
But it backfired spectacularly.
Oh, completely. A total political miscalculation.
Yeah.
Even with cheaper tea, the colonists saw it as a trick. A sneaky way to get them to implicitly accept Parliament's right to tax them by buying the tea and paying that existing Townshend duty on it. They felt they were being bribed with cheap tea to give up their fundamental political principle.
Which brings us right back to that core principle, the bedrock of the whole revolution.
It really is the banner they all rallied under. They hated these taxes, yes, but the reason was consistent. Only their own assemblies, the ones with their elected representatives, had the right to tax them. And that boiled down to the slogan, the phrase that defined the whole struggle: no taxation without representation. #3, the path of confrontation.
So you have this rising political anger, this financial friction.
Yeah.
It was only a matter of time before it turned physical, right? These flare-ups started happening, pushing things closer to actual war. First, you get the Boston Massacre in 1770, British soldiers firing into a crowd, 5 colonists killed. Really stark image of the tension caused by having troops stationed in cities.
And then you had colonists taking direct action, too, like the burning of the Gaspee down in Rhode Island. That was a British customs ship, actively hunting smugglers. Colonists rode out, forced to the ground, just torch, open defiant.
But the big one, the one that really pushed Parliament over the edge, was the Boston Tea Party in 1773. Colonists, famously dressed up as Native Americans, boarded those 3 ships and chucked 342 chests of tea straight into Boston Harbor. Huge financial loss for the East India Company.
And that act of defiance, that destruction of property, provoked a reaction from London that basically guaranteed war was coming. Parliament was absolutely livid. They retaliated with a package of laws the colonists called the Intolerable Acts. In Britain, they call them the Coercive Acts. The name difference tells you a lot. The goal wasn't subtle negotiation anymore. It was punishment. Pure and simple assertion of British dominance.
And the measures were brutal, specifically targeting Massachusetts. They shut down Boston Harbor completely until the tea was paid for basically choking the city's economy. They also passed the Massachusetts Government Act, which effectively ripped up the colony's charter, drastically limiting their self-government.
And critically, a new quartering act, making it easier for the British Army to demand housing from the colonists. It felt like a military occupation was tightening its grip. The British thinking was, let's make an example of Massachusetts, crush them, and the others will fall in line.
But it had the exact opposite effect, didn't it? Instead of isolating Massachusetts, the other colonies looked at this and thought, whoa, if they can do that to them, they can do it to us next. This sort of shared fear pushed them together.
And that led directly to the First Continental Congress, September 1774, in Philadelphia. This was a huge step, getting delegates from almost all the colonies together in one room.
Yeah, the sources list the attendees, and it's like a who's who of the founding generation. You've got George Washington from Virginia, John and Samuel Adams from Massachusetts, the firebrands, Patrick Henry, the great speaker, John Jay from New York. These were the leading minds, political heavyweights, all gathering to figure out a unified response.
But, and this is important, their goal, even then, was still relatively limited. They weren't talking independence yet, not openly anyway. They issued a Declaration of Rights, organized more boycotts of British goods. They were still essentially petitioning the king and Parliament, trying to find a way back to restore their rights within the British Empire. They basically gave London one last chance to change course.
That last chance, that hope for reconciliation, it didn't even last a year. We jump straight to the event that lit the fuse, April 18th and 19th, 1775.
Right. The British command in Boston got intel. They knew the colonial militias, the Minutemen, were building up a stockpile of weapons and gunpowder out in Concord. And they also knew that key revolutionary leaders Samuel Adams and John Hancock were staying nearby in Lexington.
So on the night of April 18th, British regulars marched out of Boston. The plan: seize the weapons cached in Concord, grab Adams and Hancock. Very targeted operation. And this, of course, is when Paul Revere and William Dawes make their famous midnight rides, warning the countryside the regulars are coming out.
And the very next morning, April 19th, it happens. In Lexington, a small group of militia stood on the town green as the British column approached. A shot rang out.
Yeah.
To this day, nobody knows for sure who fired first. But that was it. The shot heard round the world. Fighting broke out. The British pushed through Lexington, but by the time they got to Concord, the alarm had spread. Colonial militias were swarming. The British found some supplies, destroyed them, but then their march back to Boston turned into a running battle. They were harassed, sniped at the whole way back. Heavy casualties.
The war was on, no question now. And the colonies had to react quickly, organize themselves. The Second Continental Congress met again in Philadelphia, starting in May, but really getting down to business in June 1775. They realized they needed a proper army, not just scattered militias, especially with thousands of armed colonists now surrounding the British in Boston.
So they formally established the Continental Army, a unified force. And crucially, they needed a commander, someone to lead it. And they made a really politically savvy choice. They picked George Washington, a Virginian. He had military experience from the French and Indian War, projected a certain gravity, but putting a Southerner in charge of what was, at that point, mostly a New England army, was a brilliant move to foster colonial unity. #V. Early battles and shifting confidence. Okay, so Washington's appointed, the army is formed. But those early days were, let's just say, a steep learning curve. Just a few days after the Army's official creation, June 1775, you get the Battle of Bunker Hill, which, fun fact, mostly happened on Breed's Hill nearby.
Right. The Americans had dug in on the high ground overlooking Boston. Smart move. The British, under General Howe, decided on these incredibly costly frontal assaults up the hill. They took the hill eventually, but only because the Americans literally ran out of ammunition. Militarily, technically, it was American defeat. They lost the ground.
But Bunker Hill is this classic example of a tactical loss being a strategic win, in a way. Our sources really emphasize this paradox. Yes, the Americans retreated, but they inflicted absolutely devastating casualties on the British regulars. Over 1,000 British killed or wounded, compared to maybe 450 Americans. The British commanders learned right then that beating these rebels wasn't going to be a walk in the park. It would be bloody. And the Americans, even in defeat, they learned they could stand up to the best army in the world and hurt them badly. It was a huge psychological boost, despite the loss.
A painful confidence builder, maybe, but that momentum didn't really hold. The rest of 1775, into the winter, things went pretty badly for the Americans. Washington's army was constantly struggling, outnumbered, lacking supplies, guns, training. Morale was often dangerously low.
Yeah, the fall and winter of 75 were tough. Yeah, but things started to shift late winter 76. And it came down to logistics. Cannons, specifically. Remember those heavy guns the Americans had captured way back at Fort Ticonderoga in upstate New York?
Oh, yeah, Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys.
Right. Well, Washington tasked this young bookseller turned artillery chief, Henry Knox, with an insane mission. Drag those cannons hundreds of miles over snow and ice all the way to Boston.
And he actually did it. 60 tons of artillery. Incredible feat.
Absolutely incredible. And having those heavy guns changed everything. Washington was able to secretly fortify Dorchester Heights, which overlooked Boston and the harbor where the British fleet was anchored. Suddenly, the British position in Boston was untenable. They were staring down the barrels of their own captured cannons. This forced General Howe's hand. In March 1776, he decided to cut his losses, evacuate his entire army from Boston, and sail north to Halifax, Canada.
So the British are out of Boston. Big win for the Americans.
It was. But Howe wasn't giving up. Not by a long shot. He was retreating to regroup, to gather reinforcements. He was already planning his next move, a massive invasion aimed at New York City. He knew that was the key to crushing the rebellion for good. Hashtag the Sexton. Declaring independence.
So Howe sails away in March 76. By this point, the war has been raging, really, for a full year. And the whole political feeling in the colonies had shifted dramatically, hadn't it?
Oh, massively.
Yeah.
A huge part of that was Thomas Paine's pamphlet, Common Sense. Came out early in 76. It just blew away all the old arguments for loyalty to the king. Written in plain, fiery language that everyone could understand, it made the case for immediate independence incredibly powerfully. By June 1776, the calls for a complete break from Britain were getting louder and louder across the colonies. It wasn't just about fixing grievances anymore.
And the Continental Congress caught up with that popular feeling. They appointed a committee to draft a formal declaration, and the main writer, the guy holding the pen, was Thomas Jefferson.
Jefferson's role here is just foundational, isn't it? He drew heavily on Enlightenment ideas, John Locke, natural rights, the idea that government gets its power from the people. He crafted this document that wasn't just a list of complaints against the king, though it had that too. It laid out a whole philosophy for a new kind of nation, that core idea. Governments derived their just powers from the consent of the governed. Revolutionary stuff.
And then, the big day, July 4th, 1776, the Continental Congress formally adopts the Declaration of Independence. This was it. No turning back. They weren't fighting for their rights as Englishmen anymore. They were fighting to exist as a brand new independent country. The stakes just went way, way up. Now it was literally life or death. Treason if they failed.
Declaring independence pretty much guaranteed a massive British response. The Crown was not going to let the colonies just walk away. They aimed to crush this rebellion, and fast. The very same month the Declaration was adopted, July 1776, the British unleashed the largest military force they had ever sent overseas. Over 32,000 professional soldiers, hundreds of warships, descending on New York Harbor.
And Washington's army, still relatively small, maybe 20,000 men, mostly inexperienced. They were just completely outmatched. 2 months later, August 76, Howe's forces landed on Long Island. They just rolled over Washington's troops. Total rout. It was a disaster for the Americans. Washington had to execute this desperate, humiliating retreat, abandoning New York City, fleeing across New Jersey with the British right on his heels.
That retreat across New Jersey, that was probably the absolute lowest point for the Continental Army. Late 1776, morale just evaporated, enlistments were running out, men were deserting, freezing, starving. The British genuinely thought the war was practically over. They were just mopping up. Washington himself wrote about how desperate the situation was. The whole cause seemed like it was about to collapse.
But this is where Washington, maybe not as a grand strategist, but as a leader who could inspire desperate action, really shone. He knew he needed something, a win, anything, to stop the bleeding.
And that desperation led to, well, one of the most famous moments of the war. Christmas night, 1776, Washington gathers his remaining troops, crosses the ice-choked Delaware River in the middle of the winter storm, and launches a surprise dawn attack on the Hessian garrison at Trenton, New Jersey.
These were German mercenaries hired by the British.
Right, and they were completely caught off guard, probably nursing hangovers from Christmas celebrations. The battle was short, decisive, huge American victory captured nearly 1,000 Hessians.
Psychologically massive, right, even if militarily small in the grand scheme. And he didn't stop there. He followed it up just over a week later, another clever maneuver, another victory near Princeton.
Exactly. Those two quick jabs, Trenton and Princeton, they didn't win the war, not even close. But they were absolutely vital. They revived the flagging hopes of the rebels, as the sources say. Showed the army could still fight, could still win. It basically saved the revolution from dying right there in the winter of 76-77. #8. The Saratoga strategy and failure. Okay, so the Americans survived the winter, but that little flicker of hope just made the British more determined to snuff it out for good in 1777. This leads them to cook up the Saratoga strategy. On paper, it looked like a pretty solid military plan, a classic pincer movement.
And the objective was clear, wasn't it? Cut the colonies in two, isolate New England, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, etc., which they saw as the real heart of the rebellion from the rest. Control the Hudson River Valley from Canada down to New York City, and you control the continent, basically.
That was the idea. It involved two main forces, maybe a third smaller one. General John Burgoyne, Gentleman Johnny, would lead a large army south from Canada, down Lake Champlain. He was supposed to meet up near Albany, New York, with General Howe, who was expected to march his large army north up the Hudson River from New York City. There was also a smaller British force supposed to come in from the west, from Lake Ontario, but that fizzled out pretty early. The key link was Burgoyne coming south, Howe coming north.
But the whole thing fell apart because of, well, terrible coordination, or maybe Howe just had other ideas.
A bit of both, really. There was definitely poor communication between London, Howe, and Burgoyne. But crucially, General Howe became obsessed with capturing Philadelphia. He saw it as the American capital, the seat of the Continental Congress. He thought taking it would be this huge symbolic victory that would demoralize the Americans.
So instead of going north to help Burgoyne, he takes his army south.
Exactly. He puts his army on ships, sails down to the Chesapeake Bay, lands, and marches on Philadelphia, and he does capture it. He beats Washington in a battle of Brandywine Creek in September 77. The British occupy Philadelphia a couple of weeks later, Congress has to flee, so Howe gets his political prize. But strategically, it's a disaster for the overall British plan because he completely abandons Burgoyne, leaving him stranded up north.
And Burgoyne's march south wasn't exactly easygoing either, was it?
Oh, it was a nightmare for him. He was moving through dense wilderness, dragging this enormous baggage train, apparently, including his personal champagne supply. The train was tough, and the American militia were constantly harassing him, cutting down trees, destroying bridges, picking off scouts. Slowed him right down. He did manage to retake Fort Ticonderoga back in July, which looked good on paper, but it cost him time and stretched his supply lines even thinner. All through the late summer and early fall, Burgoyne is getting deeper into trouble. He's losing men, running low on food, and he's still expecting Howe to show up any day. But Howe's busy down near Philly. Washington, meanwhile, even after losing Philadelphia, he keeps Howe occupied. He launches a counterattack at Germantown, doesn't quite work. He has to pull back, but it forces Howe to keep his focus south. And then Washington takes his battered army into winter quarters at a place called Valley Forge, a name synonymous with suffering. But strategically, he kept Howe away from Burgoyne.
So while Washington is dealing with the loss of Philly and heading into that terrible winter at Valley Forge, things are coming to a head for Burgoyne up in New York.
Completely isolated now. He's facing a growing American army under General Horatio Gates. Though, a lot of the credit for the actual battlefield leadership probably belongs to Benedict Arnold.
Yeah, that Benedict Arnold before he turned traitor.
Burgoyne tries to break through the American lines. There are two key battles, Freeman's Farm in September, and then the really decisive one, Bemis Heights, in early October. He's beaten back both times.
His situation becomes impossible, right? Surrounded, outnumbered, supplies gone.
Totally impossible. He's got nowhere to go. On October 17, 1777, Burgoyne is forced to surrender his entire army, close to 6,000 soldiers, to the Americans. And this victory, Saratoga, it's not just another win. For you, the listener, trying to understand the war's arc, this is the turning point. Capital T, capital P, Saratoga changed absolutely everything. Not because of the land captured or the soldiers taken, but because of what it meant diplomatically.
Okay, explain that. Why was it such a big deal on the world stage?
Because it finally convinced France to jump into the war openly as America's ally. Look, the French had been secretly helping the Americans since '76, sending money, gunpowder, weapons. Their foreign minister, Vergennes, hated the British and saw a chance to weaken them. But the French king, Louis XVI, was understandably hesitant. Declaring war on Britain was a huge risk. He needed proof that the Americans weren't just some flash-in-the-pan rebellion, that they actually had a shot at winning. He didn't want to back a loser.
And Saratoga was that proof, a whole British army surrendering to these rebel farmers.
Exactly. It showed the world, and specifically France, that the Americans were serious, that they could defeat well-led professional British troops in a major campaign. So soon after the news reached Paris, the negotiations kicked into high gear. In early 1778, France formally recognized the United States and signed treaties of alliance, and boom, suddenly this isn't just a colonial revolt anymore, it's a global war. Britain now has to fight France too, all over the world. And critically, France had a powerful navy, something the Americans desperately lacked. That French naval power would prove absolutely decisive later on.
Okay, so that alliance gets inked February 6, 1778. Big deal. France guarantees troops, money, and crucially, those warships you mentioned. This immediately changes Britain's whole strategic calculation, doesn't it? They can't just focus all their power on America anymore.
Not at all. They now have to worry about French attacks in the Caribbean, in India, even the threat of a French invasion of Britain itself. It stretches their resources incredibly thin. Meanwhile, while the diplomats are doing their thing, Washington's army is still shivering through that awful winter at Valley Forge. But even amidst the suffering, something really important is happening there. Transformation. This is where Baron von Steuben comes in. A Prussian officer, maybe fudged his resume a bit, but he knew drill.
Right, our sources highlight him. What exactly did he do for the Continental Army? It wasn't just about marching in straight lines, was it?
Oh no, it was fundamental. Steuben basically took this collection of determined but disorganized militias and started forging them into a professional army. He wrote a standardized drill manual in French initially, had to be translated. He taught the officers how to train their men effectively. He drilled them relentlessly. Crucially, he taught them how to use bayonets properly. Americans were notoriously bad at bayonet fighting before Steuben. He even improved camp layout and sanitation, which cut down dramatically on disease, a huge killer. By the spring of '78, the army that marched out of Valley Forge was tougher, more disciplined, and much more capable of facing the British in open battle.
And they got a chance to prove that pretty quickly. The British decided to abandon Philadelphia, holding it was proving too costly with the French now in the war. The new British commander, Sir Henry Clinton, he replaced Howe, started marching his army back across New Jersey towards the safety of New York City. Washington saw an opportunity.
Yeah, Washington attacked the British rearguard near Monmouth Courthouse, New Jersey, June 28, 1778. Scorching hot day. And the Battle of Monmouth was really the first major test for Steuben's newly trained troops. And they did pretty well. They stood firm against British counterattacks, used those bayonets. Molly Pitcher legend comes from this battle too. But tactically, the battle ended up being pretty much a draw. Both sides took heavy losses from the fighting and the heat exhaustion. Clinton was able to disengage his army and continue the retreat to New York.
So Monmouth didn't deliver a knockout blow. And then later that summer, a planned joint attack with the French fleet against the British base at Newport, Rhode Island. That kind of fizzled out too, right? Bad weather, bad coordination.
Yeah, right. And those two events, Monmouth ending in a draw, the Newport operation failing, they basically signal a start of a new phase of the war, at least in the North. It becomes a stalemate. The British are too strong in their coastal bases like New York City for Washington to push them out. But they also don't really have the manpower, especially with France involved, to risk major campaigns deep into the countryside anymore. Kind of stuck.
Yeah.
Hashtag XI. The Southern Campaign and American victories. So with things deadlocked up north, the British decide to shift their main effort. They roll out their Southern strategy. The thinking was, okay, the North is too tough, too radical. But the Southern colonies, Georgia, the Carolinas, Virginia, they believed these areas had large populations of loyalists, people still loyal to the king. The plan was to land troops, rally these loyalists, secure the South, and then kind of squeeze the rebellion from both ends.
And initially it seemed to work, didn't it? They had some major successes down there.
They did. They captured Savannah, Georgia, pretty easily in late 78, early 79. Then in May 1780, a huge blow. They captured Charleston, South Carolina. Charleston was the most important city and port in the South. Thousands of American soldiers were captured, a major disaster. Then Lord Charles Cornwallis, a very aggressive and capable British general, takes command in the South. He marches inland, crushes another American army at Camden, South Carolina in August 1780. For a while there, it really looked like the British might actually subdue the entire South. The South proved to be a different kind of war. The distances were vast, the terrain difficult, and the American resistance adapted. You saw the rise of really effective patriot militia and partisan leaders, guys like Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, or Thomas Sumter, Andrew Pickens. They didn't fight big pitched battles often. They used guerrilla tactics, hit and run raids, ambushing supply columns, harassing British outposts, made life miserable for the occupying forces.
And this partisan warfare kind of softened the ground, setting the stage for some more conventional but absolutely crucial American victories that turned the tide in the South.
It's exactly. The first really big shock to the British Southern strategy came at Kings Mountain, right on the border of North and South Carolina, October 7th, 1780. This wasn't Continentals versus Redcoats. It was basically patriot militia, mostly tough frontiersmen from Appalachia, the Overmountain men, against a large force of loyalist militia commanded by a British officer, Major Patrick Ferguson.
Ferguson had apparently threatened the frontiersmen, told them to lay down their arms or he'd march over the mountains and hang their leaders. Bad move.
Very bad move.
Yeah.
The Overmountain men swarmed Kings Mountain, surrounded Ferguson's force, and just wiped them out. Ferguson himself was killed. Our sources say this single battle cost Cornwallis about a third of his total force in the Carolinas. And crucially, it shattered the idea that the British could rely on widespread loyalist support. Loyalists became terrified of Patriot reprisals after Kings Mountain.
Okay, so that's a major blow. And then comes another one just a few months later, even more significant militarily.
Yes, the Battle of Cowpens, South Carolina, January 17, 1781. This one is often studied as a tactical masterpiece. The American commander was General Daniel Morgan, brilliant leader. He was facing a detachment of elite British troops under Colonel Bannister Tarleton, known for his aggressive tactics. Morgan set up this ingenious defensive line. He put his less reliable militia right out front, told them, look, just fire 2 shots, then get out of there, run back behind the main line.
Knowing the British would charge after the retreating militia.
Exactly. Tarleton saw the militia break and thought, aha, typical rebels running away. He ordered his men to charge right in. But waiting behind the militia line were Morgan's corps of disciplined Continental regulars. They stood firm, delivered devastating volleys. And then, Morgan unleashed his cavalry, which he'd hidden, hitting the British flanks. It was a perfectly executed trap. Double envelopment. Tarleton's force was practically destroyed, huge numbers killed, wounded, or captured. Cowpens was a stunning American victory. It proved the Continentals could outfight the best of the British regulars with smart tactics, and it forced Cornwallis to abandon his plans of pacifying South Carolina. He became obsessed with chasing Morgan's army north, deeper into North Carolina, and eventually into Virginia, which leads us directly to the endgame.
So Cornwallis chases the Americans north, wins a costly battle at Guilford Courthouse, but his army is worn down. He eventually makes the fateful decision to march his army into Virginia, hoping to regroup and resupply by sea. He ends up fortifying a position on the coast at a place called Yorktown in the summer of 1781. He thought it was a good, defensible deepwater port. Turned out to be a trap.
A perfect trap, and this is where everything comes together for the Americans and their French allies. Washington sees this incredible opportunity. Cornwallis is stuck on a peninsula. Washington, coordinating brilliantly with the French commander Rochambeau, makes a bold move. They pretend they're going to attack Clinton back in New York City, completely deceiving the British. Then they rapidly march their combined French and American armies hundreds of miles south to Virginia.
An amazing feat of logistics and secrecy for the time, and the numbers they brought to bear were just overwhelming, weren't they?
Huge. You had something like 14,000 Allied troops on land surrounding Yorktown. But the absolute P, the checkmate move, happened at sea. The French fleet, under Admiral de Grasse, sailed up from the Caribbean at just the right moment. They fought off the British fleet that was trying to rescue or resupply Cornwallis in the Battle of the Chesapeake.
So the French controlled the waters.
Completely. De Grasse blockaded the entrance to the Chesapeake Bay with those 36 French warships. Cornwallis was totally cut off. No supplies coming in, no escape route by sea. He was besieged by land and by sea.
The sources make it pretty clear he was done for. Surrounded, pounded by French and American artillery day and night, no hope of relief. Eventually, he had to face facts. On October 19, 1781, Cornwallis surrendered his entire army.
Yeah, the surrender ceremony itself is iconic. Cornwallis claimed he was sick, sent his second-in-command, O'Hara, to offer the sword. O'Hara tried to surrender it to Rochambeau, the French general, but Rochambeau pointed him to Washington. Washington, in turn, had his own second, Benjamin Lincoln, accept the surrender. Lots of protocol drama. But the bottom line was, a second entire British army had been captured. This effectively ended major military operations in the war. Parliament basically threw in the towel after Yorktown.
Now, fighting didn't totally stop everywhere immediately. The British still held places like New York, Charleston, Savannah for a while longer.
Right, the mopping up took time. The last British troops didn't leave Charleston and Savannah until late 1782. New York City was evacuated last, in November 1783. But the political outcome was decided at Yorktown. It took another couple of years of negotiations in Europe to hammer out the details. The war officially, formally ended with the signing of the Treaty of Paris on September 3, 1783. And in that treaty, Great Britain did something unprecedented. It formally recognized the independence of the United States of America and ceded them a vast territory, all the land east of the Mississippi River. #tag and 13. Why the Revolutionary War matters, connecting to the learner.
Okay, so we followed the whole arc. From those early tax disputes, the Stamp Act, the Tea Party, through Washington's struggles, the crucial turning point at Saratoga, the shift to the South, and finally the decisive victory at Yorktown with French help. So let's synthesize this for you, the listener. Why does this war, fought over 2 centuries ago, still matter so much? What's the big takeaway?
Well, fundamentally, the Revolutionary War is the creation story of the United States.
Yeah.
It's the event through which this nation came into being, built really on a foundation of quite radical political ideas for the time.
It wasn't just about swapping one ruler for another. It was about establishing a completely new type of government, wasn't it?
Exactly. Think about the world in 1776. Almost every major nation was ruled by kings, queens, emperors, hereditary monarchs, or by entrenched aristocracies. The United States became the first major nation in the modern world to successfully reject monarchy and attempt to build a large-scale republic, a democracy based on a written constitution and the principle of popular sovereignty. This idea that legitimate power comes from the people, not down from a king, that was truly revolutionary and, frankly, a huge gamble. Nobody knew if it could actually work on that scale.
And the impact went far beyond American shores, right? These ideas didn't just stay here.
Not at all. The American victory sent shockwaves around the world. It obviously inspired other independence movements in the Americas later on, but it also profoundly influenced thinking in Europe. It showed that a people could challenge and overthrow an established imperial power. It helped fuel the intellectual ferment that led directly to the French Revolution just a few years later. It demonstrated that government, by consent of the governed, wasn't just a philosopher's dream, it could be a reality. It really did help usher in a new era, challenging the old order everywhere. Hashtag tag outro.
So there you have it, a pretty clear path when you lay it out. The initial tensions over taxes and rights, the outbreak of fighting, the bold move for independence, the critical turning point that brought in allies, the shift in strategy to the south, and finally, the combined victory that secured it all. A detailed picture of how those colonies managed that improbable win.
And as you think about that incredible achievement, we want to leave you with maybe one final thought to chew on. Something that highlights the sheer complexity of actually making a revolution happen. Consider this. Saratoga was the turning point. We agree on that. But why? Because it convinced the absolute monarchy of France to help. The Americans needed French troops, French money, and especially the French Navy, all provided by King Louis VI, to defeat the constitutional monarchy of Great Britain. So what does that deep reliance on one king to help you beat another king tell you about the messy, practical realities of trying to establish a democracy? Freedom, it seems, sometimes needs help from unlikely, even contradictory sources. It just shows how tangled and difficult those first steps towards self-government really were.
That's a fascinating point to ponder. Definitely adds another layer. Well, thank you for sharing all these sources and insights with us, and thank you, our listener, for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you on the next one.